Good morning again, everybody. I'm really happy to be joining you. One quick disclaimer is I have somehow come across a kind of a chest cold that includes a cough. So I apologize in advance. I'm pretty sure I will be coughing, and I'll do my best to keep it under control, and hopefully it won't get too much in the way. So I'm really happy to be joining here with a little time to share thoughts. Basically, this presentation is, from my perspective, after kind of looking back on 26 years in the public agency in Vermont, charged with what's known as the conservation and economic management of Vermont's forest lands. Um, that kind of the enabling statutes for that give responsibility and direction to the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation, which I was commissioner of that department for 12 of the 26 years, and served also as state forester during that time. And so I've now had a little over a year since I stepped down from that role. Prior 14 years as a service forester, what we call a county forester, giving technical assistance to private landowners, municipalities, then becoming commissioner. So really now I've had a year plus to kind of reflect and think about, and what I'm put together here is thoughts on the status of Vermont's forests, from forest health and sustainability, with an attempt to give some thought to what Vermont might teach the world about forests and forestry. So really, I'm simply sharing some thoughts and reflections from one forester on the state of our forest lands here, changes in conservation and stewardship over the last few decades, and a look ahead to where we might be going with our relationship with forests, including forestry. I'll admit, and I talked to Katie a bit about this. I'm thinking, well, why Vermont? Like, it's so small, and there's almost no people here. So, what does it matter, and what could we offer? Well, we are a heavily forested state. There's an awful lot at stake presently, and though we have had a little bit of a different history in terms of land use, and particularly forest land use, our forests generally are pretty representative of the Northeast, and we face many of the similar sort of challenges, and I'd like to think opportunities that our other New England and Northeast states share. So I hope you'll indulge a little bit of Vermont isms here, and as I, just unabashedly bring this to you with that perspective from here. Also, I don't think it will surprise anyone. My approach with this is to consider the state of forests in three dimensions. That is the three legs of sustainability: ecological, economic, and cultural. Then again, I'm going to finish with some commentary on what maybe this all could mean and where we're headed, and what if anything, we might learn from it. First, I want to begin with kind of level setting, a brief history of Vermont's forests and people's relationship with them. We are, I would say, blessedly forested here, and it's been this way mostly for millennia. That is, since the last glaciation, 10, 12,000 years ago, trees and forests have indeed been the dominant expression of Vermont's landscape, taking many forms and conditions over time, even while we, the people, have left and now continue to leave our mark. This broad history, has been marked by various pulses of human activity in our forests, mostly for extractive purposes. And after each pulse of such activity, Vermont's forests have returned. So again, much is made here, by the way, of being a native Vermonter, and I guess my thesis is that forests are the original native Vermonters, and it is a natural expression of this landscape. So we know from some historical evidence, and people with more knowledge than me, that native peoples lived in close relation to Vermont's native forests for many, many years, taking and making their lives in and from the woods, concentrated in particular along water bodies and waterways. Their numbers were thought to be relatively low, and their forest impact real, if somewhat localized. Nevertheless, early European settlers found upon arrival here an expansive, complex forest primeval from which they scratched and hacked a subsistence living at first. Over time, that grew to more intensive forms of agriculture as they cleared land in increasing numbers, extent, and intensity over many decades, using immense amounts of wood for fuel and building all the while, including supplying burgeoning cities nearby like Boston, New York, and Montreal. By the mid 1800s, Vermont was then only 20% forested, barely. That was high elevations, very difficult places to access. By and large, the state had been cleared of its native forests. But given the chance offered by widespread farm abandonment and westward expansion to places like Minnesota, I might add, after the Civil War, Vermont's landscape once again showed its true identity. Forests happened again. They were much changed in condition, age and species mix in particular, and who even knows how ecologically depleted they may have been. But Vermont's forests returned indeed. They grew and they expanded and they continued to give and to supply a growing range of goods, benefits, and values for people, for us. This happened, that happened, and the forests kept on keeping on and giving all that they give. For well over 100 years after that, Vermont's forests kept growing, bigger, taller, older, and expanding in extent, eventually covering about 80% of the state. And all the while, this has been a pretty good deal, mostly for us, I would say, for the people. Just consider for a moment all the ways that we depend on forests, like most people, and it's especially true here in Vermont, from wood products and biodiversity to landscape resilience, community wellness and vitality, not to mention a world-class outdoor recreation and tourism economy built on it and inextricably linked to it. Only Hawaii has a greater proportion of its gross domestic product derived from outdoor recreation than Vermont, and only Alaska has a higher participation rate in wildlife-based recreation activities. We are an outdoor state. So whether we know it or not, acknowledge it or ignore it, we are utterly dependent on forests. Like always, this is not unique to Vermonters, of course. Ever since there have been people and trees, people have been dependent on trees for food, shelter, tools, fuel, medicine, art, music, and more. Like other rural communities, we here in Vermont are just a little closer to it still than many. And while we Vermonters continue a strong tradition of active woodland stewardship, it is on the wane, seriously in decline. And we just barely produce an equivalent amount of wood as we consume in our lives, in sort of gross terms. But we do consume plenty. From flooring and firewood to furniture and paper and well beyond, Vermonters, like most people, use significant volumes of forest products. And if you zoom out a little bit beyond Vermont right now, recent data and analyses show it's pretty grim and striking. 70% of New England's forest products consumptions occurs in southern New England, while 70% of New England's production occurs in Maine. We have been sort of living in this somewhat illusory sort of circumstance where we really depend on Maine and its industrial forest lands to supply the equivalent volume of woods, while we approach 25% of our landscape in permanent conservation protection. Much of that intended to be free from harvest. So this is the sort of bringing us to a tension point now, I would suggest. Again, it's been a really good deal. For multiple human generations, Vermont's landscape has been stewarded largely by family owners as opposed to industrial owners, living closely and intelligently on that land over 100 years of forest regrowth and expansion, and with a culture of working on and with the land. This combination was manifest in local scale forestry, with logging common, recurring, and accepted, if not always revered. Imagine that, in a grading forest and a culture of people largely from and of the land. What's not to like about that, especially as a forester, is it's a really easy environment and context in which to practice forestry, and a grading forest system and a culture of people stewarding the land. But now, for the first time in over a century, according to FIA data, Vermont is losing forest land. It's not the sky is falling, it's not the end of times, but it really ought to be a signal. For the first time in well over a century, we're going the other direction in terms of forest land. Losing it, by the way, as in converting forest to something else, something not forested and that is not a forest, and most likely won't ever be again. So the question then is how or why? What has changed such that this stunningly and improbably resilient forested landscape, a landscape we depend on and that has come to define us? Remember, we are the Green Mountain State for a reason. So how indeed would this resilient forest quite suddenly start to recede? A forest that has been harvested repeatedly in ways mostly good and even some bad for centuries now is no longer bouncing back. Are we harvesting too much, too fast? What gives? Remember, deforestation is a change in land use, permanent conversion from forest. That's what we're talking about here, as opposed to logging, which is for forestry purposes, which is very much confused right now. When people hear deforestation, they say we need to stop logging. And that's something we're going to drill into a little bit further. So is it a simple matter of increasing numbers of people here in Vermont, just sort of upping the demands on land use? Well, that's doubtful, given that there's still so few of us. We have 635,000 Vermonters, and our population is not growing, actually. And we have good evidence that we are actually consuming land in terms of development and conversion at a rate that exceeds our rate of population growth. This is clearly not sustainable and is worth looking at. So what does give here? What explains this first time in 100 years loss of forest land? I like to think, and we have a lot of fun thinking about how there remains some magic and mystery to some aspects of Vermont's forests. I would say maple sugaring and fall color spring to mind when we think of these sort of magical and mysterious aspects of our forest. But the causes and drivers of forest loss in Vermont are not among these mysteries. It is indeed well documented and not at all disputed that forest loss here is attributable to landscape parcelization, that's real estate subdivision, and to fragmentation, the conversion to non-forest use. And clear as this evidence is, though, forest loss does not tell the whole story. And troublesome as it is unto itself that we're losing forest this way, the amount of forest on a landscape is but one measure of its status. Given forest land's deep and wide importance to us, it's in our interest to also consider their health and sustainability, especially considering that forest fragmentation and conversion threaten both. So that's really where I'm coming from here. So I'm going to pivot now with that background, sort of broad strokes of where we stand in terms of forest, and drill into the condition of our forest and forest health and sustainability, because those really are key. So by my definition, what we've used in the department for years, it would be that healthy forests are ecologically functional and resilient to disturbance. They have a capacity for self-renewal. And clearly, this is not simple as a definition of forest health. And I would suggest that sustainability is even more complicated. So I'm going to go one at a time. We'll start with forest health first. That was kind of our motto at the department, forest health first. Well, there is no single measure or an indicator or kind of a probe you can stick into a forest and get a reading of forest health. It is often defined, again, as that capacity for recovery from disturbance and for self-renewal. So think of forest health in terms of function, normal ecologic function, that is. Things like nutrient cycling and hydrologic regulation and pollination, to name a few examples of forest function. Normal function is an indicator of a healthy forest. Abnormal function is an indicator of forest health problems. In this way, I like to think the word forest is really better understood as a verb than a noun because of all the things that forests do. Indeed, forests are not simply static assemblages of trees. They are marked by variation, dynamism, by pattern, process, and function. This notion of healthy forests doing things is only compounded when we consider what healthy forests do for us. In short, when forests are healthy, they function well and they serve us incomparably well. When they are not functioning well, they are not healthy, and their health affects ours in a cascade of ill effects. So this really should be a reminder to us all that we are part of the forest community and that we make massive daily demands on what forests do. This, in turn, underscores my personal definition of forestry: the peaceful and productive coexistence of people and forests. As to sustainability, it is, for sure, even more complicated, in part because, well, naturally, it is influenced and indicated by forest health. It's connected. But also because sustainability is not one-dimensional. Any assessment of forest sustainability has to include more than just a measure of forest health, as important as that is, and fundamental, or ecological sustainability. It must also consider those other elements of cultural and economic sustainability. In the real world, none of these is possible without the other. So accordingly, my overview here of the current status of Vermont's forest is again organized by that three-legged stool of sustainability: ecologic, economic, and cultural. So here we go. First, the really good news. We like to say Vermont is forest strong. Around the time of Hurricane Irene in 2011, I had just become commissioner, taking over the large department with a fantastic mission. We had a major hurricane turned into a tropical storm, and it had devastating effects on Vermont's landscape, flooding, tree loss. It was intense. And out of that, Vermonters rallied, as Vermonters do in rural communities that had become isolated, pulled together, helped each other. And out of this came this statewide sort of, it's a phrase and a rallying cry that we're Vermont strong. And now it's on license plates. It's sort of our unofficial motto. We're Vermont strong. We rally, we put up with things, and we help each other. And that motivated me to think that it's equally powerful and important to see so much of Vermont's strength is engendered by its forests. For sure, the storm would have had far worse effects if we had not been so heavily forested, attenuating the falling of rain and the raging of rivers. And so from this, we kind of gave birth to this other idea that we are Vermont strong and Vermont is forest strong. Again, the dominant land use covering now just about 3/4 of our state. Broadly speaking, our forests are in pretty good shape. They're largely intact, remarkably resilient, and growing in volume and growing stock, if not in acres, as we've said, starting to lose those acres. So this is a very good thing, because though largely overlooked and unheralded, forests do have colossal importance in our lives, with massive public benefits accruing from largely private forest land ownership. You all know these. They include things like clean air, pollution protection, clean water, water supply, and flood resilience, carbon storage and sequestration, landscape and community resilience, habitat, biodiversity, connectivity, human health, community vitality, and quality of life. Our forests provide the natural infrastructure and the scenic backdrop for that world-class tourism and outdoor recreation economies that gird our statewide economy. So that's an impressive and important list, conferring great strength to our state. And I haven't even mentioned at this point nearly $2 billion in annual economic activity directly from wood products we use in our daily lives, produced right here in Vermont. So ecologically, culturally, and economically, our forests really do deliver. And they do so in the most cost-effective way possible, far better than other alternatives of paying for clean air and clean water. These are natural climate solutions, natural infrastructure for providing human needs. So in this way, it emerges very clearly that Vermont's forests are our unique competitive advantage. Did I tell you how small we are? We're in just this little blip, right? This is who we are and what we have. We can't compete with New York State, with other larger metropolitan areas. This is our unique competitive advantage. It's the Vermont brand, and we cannot outsource the functions and values that forests provide. There's no way of doing that, and that's what we're running up against, is potentially losing this goose that lays the golden egg, if you will. So we therefore have a very strong incentive to maintain our forest strength through conservation of healthy, intact, and functioning systems. And that's where our story here, the forest story, gets decidedly less good newsy. Again, our forests are generally doing pretty well, but there are several unsettling trends and significant threats do loom, even beyond that basic and gloomy forest conversion and loss statistic. So, some quick hits on some trends and threats. Organized first ecologically, we are seeing increasing occurrence of negative impacts from invasive pests, plants, and pathogens. We're seeing increased dieback and mortality in some tree species, including the iconic sugar maple. We're seeing decreased growth across many species writ large. We're seeing increasing regeneration failures, exacerbated by overbrowsing by ungulates and or by competition from non-native invasive plants. We're seeing climate change alterations and disruptions to ecosystem processes at a rate that outstrips forests' natural ability to adjust to such changes, and with a cascade of far-reaching effects. So phenology, the timing of bud break, out of sync with insects and birds returning, major hydrologic wackiness, species interactions kind of going awry. These are really, really significant, and they're here. We're seeing them. We're also seeing radiating, degrading effects from poorly implemented development of built infrastructure all across our landscape. Culturally, we're also seeing some unfortunate trends. COVID and the pandemic shutdown certainly had sort of a two-edged kind of thing, is that we saw historic spikes in recreational demand and impacts to forests. So on the one hand, that's really great. It helped people get outside and realize how important it is to be outside in nature. And I'd like to think we can work with that going forward. But it certainly also brought impacts, direct impacts on our landscape from overuse during that time. And it also showed our vulnerability in global supply chains and put a light on our ability that maybe potentially we could shift some things and become more locally resilient if we turned our attention to supplying our needs more locally. We're also seeing an erosion of a local land ethic of shared stewardship and connection to the land. We're seeing an increasing awareness gap about our astounding dependence on and consumption of forest products, especially wood products. We're seeing a narrow, shallow, and incomplete understanding of and reaction to climate change. Trees are good, so don't cut any, certainly don't burn any. We have pro-forestation emerging here, and activist groups like Standing Trees calling for the cessation of all logging on public lands. This is, to me, essentially junk food in the diet of forest literacy. But nonetheless, it's dominating the conversation at this point. We're seeing a loss of social license for practice of forestry. We're seeing an aging demographic of forest owners, which Vermont's one of the oldest states in the country, and 80% of our private forest lands are owned by people over 65. Not that there's anything wrong with old people. I'm hoping to be one someday. But it suggests a tipping point, a change, and of intergenerational transfer and challenges that come with that, with implications for the land. We're seeing decreasing parcel size and increasing numbers of parcels. And this all adds up to really a crisis, most notably evidenced by that significant loss of forest land for the first time in a century. And of course, this has now been accelerated and exacerbated by pandemic-induced changes in real estate demand and pricing. Our population isn't necessarily growing, but we're seeing wild shifts in real estate transactions as second home owners buy up the land and convert to their vacation homes and part-time homes. This is a powerful driver of increased forest fragmentation. And so let's see, last I'll finish with sort of an economic view of where we stand. I would say the status, and related to what I just said here about real estate, the economic status of forest land is great, absolutely great if you're selling forest land for development. But it is not great at all if you want to buy, own, hold, steward, or manage forest lands. It's crashing in pretty much every other regard economically. We have a raging storm in the forest economy that includes losses of sawmills and pulp mills in the region. We've lost 65% of our sawmills in the last 15 years here in Vermont alone. A workforce crisis, skyrocketing costs of fuel, energy, equipment, and human resources. We're seeing increased globalization of the marketplace that translates to high costs and low prices paid to the producers. Better news is there's that nascent movement toward payment for ecosystem services, monetizing forest carbon, for example. I'd say it's about time. Also, we're seeing economically no commensurate increase in the value of wood products to the landowner or even the logger, even while costs and prices to the end user of lumber have increased dramatically. Somebody's getting rich, and it's not the forest landowners, the foresters, and the loggers. People still complain here. A third of Vermont's annual harvest goes to firewood, and so people still use a lot of firewood. And people, it's like a local religion to complain about the cost of firewood that you buy if you buy at retail, and yet just the fact is that it's way less than the current prices for an equivalent heat value from heating oil, which is about half again as much. So it's sort of odd, but all of this I'm using to sort of build to a point of this cultural disconnect with our use of the land and our stewardship of the land. So what does it all mean? Is there any good news in any of this? I would say yes. I'm naturally optimistic, but I hope I can persuade you that it's more than just that. I don't mean to be Pollyannish. I think there has been in time an increasing awareness of the importance and value of forests. The pandemic and climate change have certainly shown a bright light on the role of forests and the value of forests, which is helpful. I think we've seen a slightly increased, but also at the same time a decreased awareness of the role of good forestry in keeping forests. This is tricky because it is admittedly counterintuitive, right? That we would save forests by harvesting some trees. And it gets trickier still when the conversation gets sidetracked by emotional arguments, misuse and cherry picking of science, and other distractions and conflations, which is really what we're seeing. Let me just pause here and say a quick anecdote. In Vermont, we've had a beautiful renaissance in a local food movement and a diversification of agriculture from big dairy to, well, a diversified approach to food production. And it's much celebrated and it's much supported at the state level, community level. A lot of love for farmers going on, and that's really great for sure. You put food in your body twice a day, even every day, but less, it seems, to awareness that we put some forest products in our bodies every day, clean air, clean water. And so the story is, it's not hard at all to go to a nice restaurant, say in the city of Burlington, our largest city, really trendy restaurants where you go in and it's all about local food. It's celebrated on the menu and then some. It tells you where the tomatoes are from, where the cheese is from, celebrating local producers, telling the story. And this is even in some restaurants that feature wood-fired hearths and cooking. And so they cook with wood, they feature wood and firewood prominently in the decor and the wood furniture. And my wife and I are enjoying a fabulous locally produced meal at this high-end restaurant. And I am moved to say to the server, really lovely to see the story of the food and its origins and how local it is. And I'm curious, what about the wood? You're cooking with it, you feature it in the decor. And she was stumped. She said, wow, I have no idea. To her everlasting credit, she went and got the manager. The manager came to the table and said, we've never been asked that, and I don't know, but I'm going to look into it. They came back by the time our meal was ending and said, it's from Clifford's, a firewood processor in Heinsberg, 2 towns away. And I'm thinking, isn't this something? It's locally produced from Vermont family forest owners, and it's just silent. They're not telling the story, but they're tripping over themselves to tell the story of where the food came from. I think it says a lot about where we stand and where we need to go. But again, right, I was trying to stick to the hopeful messages in all of this. So let me get back to that. I would also point as hopeful to the century-long advancement in my beloved profession, and particularly the practice of silviculture, moving away from our origins in an agricultural plantation mentality um, to a more ecological mentality, including climate smart, adaptive, restorative practices, and a renewed emphasis on the power of old forests and exciting possibilities for advancing old forest function and values in younger, somewhat stagnated forests that dominate our landscape. We've seen a similar arc of advancement in forest management operations and equipment, our logging force, a strong culture of safety and continuous improvement continues to this day among logging contractors in particular. That's good news. We also have that emerging marketplace that might someday pay landowners for the ecological services they provide, beginning with carbon, possibly including water. I think similarly, there is great potential and hope in emerging new products and applications for forest products that offer climate smart alternatives, cellulosic products like insulation, textiles, food additives, and mass timber technologies like cross-laminated timber construction and modern or advanced wood heating that is clean and efficient. These new product and market possibilities, they offer us new pathways to sustaining vibrant rural communities through exemplary forestry practice that keeps forests forests. And they offer workable climate smart alternatives to traditional products like fossil fuels, plastics, concrete, and steel. I think additional positive change is found in so many promising possibilities that are emerging to solve multiple problems: housing, heating, healthcare, climate change, rural decay, through a coherent strategy to support Vermont's working landscape of wild forests, working forests, and vibrant human communities. I'm curious if any of you have heard of the Foresters for the Birds initiative. Any hands, perhaps? This is something I'm very proud of. It happens to be a little pet baby of mine. Years ago, when I was working as a county forester, it was increasing the sense that I was only reaching people who were already reached with our outreach and technical assistance, and that there were more and more folks who really were not hearing it. But also, I sensed that there was this enormous goodwill towards wildlife and to songbirds in particular. We had a strong local partner in Audubon, Vermont, a local chapter of National Audubon, that had a nature center and did a lot of education, but they didn't want to cut any trees. I went and saw a fabulous presentation by one of their conservation biologists talking about the importance, the global importance of the northern forest here for breeding birds, particularly neotropical migrants that come here in the summer to breed, nest and breed, and that these populations were threatened and that their habitat here was so important. And he gave this great talk about the birds and their biology. And then at the end, he pivoted to forest management. And I got very nervous. And I went and spoke to him. I said, listen, your presentation on birds was fabulous and breaking down barriers and really stimulating. I'm a little concerned about some of your broad strokes on forest management. Could we talk? To his everlasting credit, we got together, we discussed the nuances of forest management, and thus was born an initiative to bring the conservation biologists and the foresters, timber-focused foresters, together. We received a Forest Service grant to pursue this, and in partnership with Audubon Vermont, we built this toolkit, a bird guide that fits in a forester's vest, the only bird guide on the planet that speaks to silviculture. We wrote an inventory procedure for how to tweak a traditional timber inventory to consider songbird habitat elements. And then the third element was to create this silviculture with birds in mind, ways that we could just slightly tweak our traditional approach to silviculture in ways that would still allow us to produce excellent timber and other wood products, but enhance songbird habitat. This thing was crowdsourced through 100 foresters here in Vermont over a few years, trying some things, tweaking it, demonstrating, and then putting the kit together. And it's a smashing success. It's now being emulated in every state from Maine to Mississippi along the Atlantic Flyway. We won a National Wings Across the Americas Partnership and Conservation Award from the Forest Service, and extremely proud of this. I share this as an example of the hope and progress that is possible when genuine partnerships succeed in capitalizing on what? The common ground that we share. Heretofore, it was biologists, conservation biologists, and foresters not talking to each other. Um, this is the common ground shared by forest lovers of all stripes. Imagine we could contribute meaningfully to the construction and heating of housing for humans with locally sourced climate smart wood from silvicultural operations that enhance and maintain breeding habitat for songbirds, among many other organisms, all while keeping forests forested for the long term and maintaining a continuous flow of the many benefits they provide, from mitigation of atmospheric CO2 and landscape resilience to water supply, water quality, and biodiversity, and to the seriously long list of goods and forest products that we rely on to live our lives. So, as early spring, and by the way, in Vermont, that means winter, brings a close to another maple sugaring season here, and we watch this glorious show, it's kind of coming back to life, when the dull grays and browns give way to a crazy variety of greens. I'm reminded once again of just how beautiful our state is, how naturally beautiful. But do well to remember that it's not a wilderness and it is not an accident. It has been brought to us by the working landscape of farms and forests and by the people who work that land, and certainly by the family and individual owners who kept and cared for this land for generations. This way, remember, when we make things, when we grow, make, and sell things like world-class cheese or globally prized hardwood furniture, for example, we make Vermont. We make Vermont, Vermont. Investing in and strengthening our land-based culture and economy is our best hope for maintaining an ecologically intact and functioning landscape that undergirds and makes it all possible. Remember, there's never been a time in the history of people when people weren't utterly dependent on trees and forests. There's no reason to think that's going to change. Fortunately, and the best news of all, remember, I'm trying to be more positive now, is that we still have a chance. We have a chance to get it right. We have so much of what is needed in place: incredible and globally important forest land, highly trained and experienced professionals with pertinent expertise, foresters, biologists, loggers, etc., all engaged and concerned landowners and other stewards, cutting-edge modern best practices, adaptive, climate-wise, ecological silviculture, continuous improvement. And we have had a culture of forestry, But what is left of it is eroding fast, and we really need to act quickly to revive it. I truly believe we can have it all now, but not under business as usual. To sustain our ecology and our economy, we need first to revive and revise our culture of forestry. Sure, we need a modernized and reinvigorated forest economy. That is, a revised, coherent system of education, training, regulation, incentives, and investments all along the forest economy value chain. This would include innovative support for forest landowners, foresters, loggers, truckers, primary processing and secondary manufacturing facilities, artisanal woodcrafting, as well as emerging 21st century forest products and applications like wood-based insulation and mass timber. And we have the modern expertise and technology to do all this. But none of that will matter. None of the expertise, experience, or equipment will matter one bit without a culture, a collective mindset, really, of ecological forestry that proudly includes both passive and active, and even restorative management on all lands, public and private. This may be the greatest challenge of all. It will require a historic, massive cultural shift. And we all need to lean into this. All of us bear some responsibility, not just the professionals or the policymakers. And it deserves so much more and so much better than what it is getting of late in the current debate about forests and forestry, especially in the context of climate change and biodiversity loss and equity and inclusion. Worse, this important conversation has been usurped by activism overtaking real advocacy, where adversarial tactics, clickbait, and emotion have overtaken facts, dialogue, listening, and learning. Emotional environmentalism is outstripping environmental science. Differences are distracting us from seeing the continent of common ground in our shared interests and responsibilities. This will not work. Instead, we need to move forward together, bonded by shared interest. We need less heat and we need more light. Light that brings bright, drama free clarity to our consumption of wood, our broad dependence on forests, and the spectacular potential of ecological forestry to hold it all together in the real world. A shared future of healthy, functional forests and human communities will not happen without a marketplace, a workforce, and an infrastructure of forestry for forests and people. A viable forest economy, that is, and a revival of the rural culture that sustains it. Thank you. I hope this stimulates at least some good conversation.
Michael, I'm curious. Um, I'm you're that was very thoughtful. It's really made my brain kick back into gear. I'm not really involved in the regional forest management much anymore, and you kind of make me wish I was again. But I'm curious. Being in the Appalachian forest chain, do you know, is anybody else in the Appalachians embracing what you've done in Vermont? Are there similar programs going south?
Yes. One example is the Foresters for the Birds initiative, the concept that is being used in most states, which is great. Um, um, and it's certainly in the Northeast, the pro-forestation movement, um, calling for moratorium on all logging on public lands, has certainly began in New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and it's made its way here. So elsewhere in the region, the sort of negative thing is happening, and I think professionals, foresters, agents, public agencies, nonprofits, they're all kind of rallying to this, but all kind of freaking out at the same time about, how did this happen? Now, I would say the pandemic in particular with climate change, it should be saying, wow, those forestry people were right. Like the pandemic said how important it is to have healthy forests nearby. It showed us how vulnerable we are in the sort of global supply chains. We had packaging shortages. We had medical supply shortages because of the shutdown. Um, we have a third of our school children here go to schools heated by wood. That was stopped. We have major hospitals heated by wood. That was stopped. So it was a wake up call, right? And at the same time, climate change saying, boy, forests really matter. You put all that together, this should be the time when society writ large is saying, those cute, cuddly forester types, they were right. And instead, it's gone like this. It's like, no, forests are really amazing and important, so we have to leave them alone and be separate from them. Thus, jettisoning a couple hundred years of a culture of being of and from and for the land. That's more common in the region, that loss. And I think everyone's scratching their head saying, how did we miss our chance? So I'm not actually, Harry, all that sanguine about, where we are here or how it is playing out elsewhere in the Appalachians. I think the threats are the same or similar, and the reaction has been similar. And so this goes well beyond us, and we need to pull it together. I think we have more of a chance than some places, but we got nothing else. This is our competitive advantage. This is what Vermont is.
Which was how the dynamic of, the birding for foresters played out, or forest for birds played out in Minnesota, is playing out in Minnesota. One of the things that the information I've been trying to download is where are the conversations that have to happen and where are those hurdles that exist, not only for timber, but, one of the conversations I had at the Forest Service last week was around prescribed fire. And the prevention fuels person here had said that Smokey Bear did too good of a job in trying to backpedal a little bit about what kind of management really does benefit all the other ecological groups in the long term. So my question was that birding dynamic in Minnesota. So Mark, I think I'll follow up with you about that more, and for the Ely area, trying to better understand those different adversaries and how we get them all to the table. As the Forest Service and the state and the county are all taking, their approaches to both harvesting and prescribed fire.
Well, you mentioned Smokey Bear there, and I think, studies have been written on the effectiveness. So it's like one of the most effective ad campaigns in history. Maybe that's what we could use now as a new Smokey for the new reality. That played to emotion, and it played to protection and vulnerability, and we have those threats. But clearly, it's like you said, it was maybe a little too good, or
Yeah.
as I once somewhat infamously said on a national podcast, Smokey lied a little bit.
Yeah.
I like your way of saying it better, because I just don't know that it tells the whole story. But what could be our new Smokey, that gets at the realities? To me, the biggest piece is that it's just so tempting to say we'll solve it by separating ourselves from it, which is colonial elitist sort of thinking. And we need to get back to the reality that we use an enormous amounts of forest stuff, and we got to be honest about that. So I'm tipping my hand here. I'm gonna pursue this a little bit further, but there's a new publication that's recently emerged called "Beyond the Illusion of Preservation" that looks at. I don't know if you can see it if I show it here, but that's not going to work. Taking regional responsibility by protecting forests, reducing consumption, and expanding ecological forestry in New England. This is getting at that notion that we're all out of whack with the amount of wood we use and the amount of wood we produce, and that it's an illusion of preservation to protect and conserve these lands around us if we're going to just export our wood demands elsewhere. And this is about taking that more regional, localized responsibility, I think, and I'm excited by the publication. We just held our New England SAF annual meeting last week with this as the keynote address and a big panel discussion of it, and it was received interestingly. It was several hundred foresters from the region, and this is unabashedly saying we need wildlands, and we need working lands, and we need to really seriously consider our consumption. And I love it because it's all three. It's not just one. There's something for everyone, something to like, maybe to be a little bit uncomfortable about. And again, the whole thing to me tells the story that we got a lot of numbers, we got a lot of expertise, and we're talking past each other when there's this continent of common ground and the reality of our connection to forests. That's what I'm going to keep hitting on, is we got to go at this realistically.
Well, thank you, Mike. And just if there's a few more questions or anything else from the team, excellent discussion.
Michael, I don't really have a question necessarily, but I like hearing another definition of forest health. Maria and I have been meeting with Marcella from our board, who's a professor at the U here. And that was one of the questions I had as like someone new to forestry I feel like I hear the term forest health constantly, and rarely hear people get more specific about what that means. And I like your kind of like active definition and like sort of thinking about a forest as a verb. I thought that was nice. Thank you.
I'm glad it's helpful. That's why I'm offering it to be helpful that way. We, as a forester trained in, tree health, about all the diseases and insects and,
Yep.
that was fundamental to any course of study in forestry, is to understand tree health and tree not health. That is not the same as forest health. And forest health is not just a summation of tree health problems.
Yep.
And, that's why we decided to land on a functional view, seeing forests as that active, functional, and connected. And anyway, so I'm glad it works for you. I hope it's helpful. That's nice to hear. I think it's more than just an academic kind of fun thing to think about, or a fun word game to call it a verb more than a noun. It gets people's attention. You may have heard of Senator Leahy. He was recently retired from the Senate. Again, remember, we're really small, so I'll forgive you if you don't know who the heck Senator Leahy was. But Patrick Leahy was senator here for 4 decades, senior senator, very effective. I was right before he retired, I was at a kind of a ribbon cutting event as commissioner for a new piece of state forest land, and there was speechifications, and I got up and gave my little blurb about verb more than noun. And the good senator got up after me as the featured speaker, and he said, Commissioner, I really like that. Forest is a verb thing more than a noun. He said, and I'm gonna use that. I'm definitely gonna use that. And the first 2 times, I'm gonna give attribution to you. After that, he made it his own. This might be here in Vermont. Everybody's got a Senator Leahy story. That's mine.
Thank you, Mike. It was absolutely wonderful presentation and discussion to launch into your series.